So we just spoke with the first of the two joke races earlier this week with the Noblars, but in that video I said I didn't actually think that they had very goods of ever showing up, ever, at least from an official capacity. But I do think there is one race that actually does have decent odds of making an appearance, and they're also hilariously inept as an army. So that's what we're going to be doing today, so get comfy with a nice big old glass of milk and let's get started.
Wow.
Today we take a look at the Halflings, a very shameless ripoff of the Hobbits from Tolkien, like excessively obvious of a ripoff. We'll get into that later. Much like the Noblar hordes, they aren't known for being a particularly potent military, and their actual form doesn't exactly inspire dread to their enemies. However, in spite of that, just like our previous example, the Halflings were actually technically given an army, though in a far different manner than the Noblar horde was. They were at first a fan submission to Citadel Journal that was given Black Library approval, Black Library being Games Workshop's publishing side, but then they were promptly forgotten about until White Dwarf, the same source that made the Noblar Horde rules, touched upon them again, and 3 months after the Noblar Horde got their rule set, which is a pretty cool coincidence in my opinion. Anyways, the Halflings are only a military in the loosest possible sense of the word. Their cavalry rides sheep, chicken, and pigs, as well as each other. Their artillery launches soup. They inherited a tank and turned it into a mobile kitchen. They're not a very focused fighting force, is my point. In spite of that, though, they were actually surprisingly effective on the tabletop when they were first introduced. A slightly improved ballistic skill compared to others meant that their ranged units could take many enemies out of the fight before the battle had even begun in earnest, almost kind of like the Wood Elves. But then, once the battle actually started, a number of smaller unit traits could make them surprisingly good at pressing their advantage further. Now, if you're familiar with the Halflings, you might be a little confused here, because the Moot is very clearly in the Old World, definitely not east of the World's Edge Mountains, as Game 3 is expected to be. Well, first up, I would say I do expect part of the map will go slightly past the World's Edge Mountains in the west, as Kislev seems to be a pretty reasonable bet, and the Moot is no further west than Kislev is. But, more importantly, the Halflings have more groups east of the World's Edge Mountains than they actually do west of it. In the Game 3 map, it would be expected that we would have the slaves of the Feastmaster tribe, the Comradeship, the Fighting Cocks, and even Tuppy and Bargash. The first of them, the slaves of the Feastmaster tribe, are exactly what they sound like, a small band of halflings that went off to the mountains of Morn and are now bullied into cooking and providing meals for the Feastmaster Ogre tribe. The Comradeship, it is an utterly shameless rip-off of the Fellowship from the Lord of the Rings, to the point where they almost share character titles. That was last seen heading towards the Firemouth, their self-imposed quest, putting them cleanly into the Game 3 map. The Fighting Cocks are a bit hard to pin down, being a mercenary band and all, but given their ties to Tilia, being somewhere on the Silk Road or Ivory Road seems the most probable, given what the mercenary bands are typically hired for. Tuppy and Bargash are my personal favorite group in the whole mix. They've been seen all over the place, though they're predominantly in Kislev, Zufbar, and especially in the World's Edge Mountains. That's actually where the partnership began. Now, in addition to the plethora of locations available, the Halflings also have a number of named characters available, especially if we open things up to the older Warhammer RPG era. Then they've got a ton of options and even, frankly, other faction possibilities. We aren't going to get into every option here, though, otherwise this video is going to balloon to like half an hour or more, but I'll list off 2 core factions and who I would have leading each one. So the first pick would be Mootland itself, led by Nicholas Warfoot, Defender of the Moot. He's got 4 items in Warfoot's Blade, Warfoot's Crest, Elidora's Necklace, and the Potion of War. Warfoot's Blade would grant armor piercing and increased damage, while his Crest would provide armor and magical resistance. Elidora's Necklace grants a ward save, and a single-use ability to crank up his melee defense to extreme heights for short duration. Lastly, his Potion of War would grant a single-use temporary damage buff and war save. He would effectively be our little melee lord, meant to go up to your enemies and bash in their shins while your ranged troops pepper them from afar, and many of his items are meant to set him up as a tank in close quarters, unlikely to kill the enemy, but also really unlikely to be killed by them as well. Their start would be an interesting one relative to Game 3, as it would basically back you into the corner of the map, where the only logical expansion would be north through Sylvania and then east through the World's Edge Mountains. This would give you a safe but agonizingly slow start compared to most others. Our second option would be the slaves of the Feastmaster tribe, led by the awesomely named Oglethorpe Bolnhelm. He's as much of a support lord, or much more of a support lord I should say, rather than a melee lord, and would benefit hot pot catapults, soup tanks, and chefs specifically. He'd have a built-in bonus to hot pot catapults, giving them increased damage when nearby, and he'd also have an ability called Fire Root Pepper on cooldown that would temporarily increase his damage while imbuing fire damage. He's got 2 items in the Champion's Chef Cleaver, which would boost melee attack and dramatically increase his armor piercing, and he's also got the Magic Drumstick, which would be a single-use item that would dramatically boost melee attack and damage temporarily. Whereas Warfoot was our tank, Bulnhelm would be our DPS lord. And while Bulnhelm would be my go-to pick for the Slaves of the Feastmaster tribe simply from a thematic perspective, there is actually a second option for them in Gabbo Flugbend. He's a little halfling adventurer armed with a bow. Gabbo himself has been known to venture across the World Jed's mountains on hunting adventures and would likely work like a shorter, fatter version of Malchus Wolfhart, a ranged, anti-large bowman. He would have the mesh net able to temporarily stop enemy units and has a number of magical items in addition to a unique mount. He can take the Hunting Spear, which is an anti-large melee weapon that would give him some decent potential up close, the Gromril Shirt, which would improve his magical resistance and armor, and the Elven Way Cloak Talisman, which gives him range resist and melee defense. He also has a unique Pegasus, Grey Wing, which would give him an incredible speed and aerial options, which would make him a nightmare to deal with in battles. The Slaves of the Feastmaster tribe would have a dramatically different start than the Moot. Deep within enemy territory, they would have an almost impossible position to defend against, with their start causing them to rebel against their ogre oppressors, which would make for an extremely tough threat to deal with early on. If they can survive against them, they'd have a much easier time expanding outwards from that point forward, but actually winning enough battles to get to that point might be a bit of a challenge. Now, there's a few more named characters for the Halflings that could be used down the road for DLC, but we'll save those for another day. So how would the roster look like? Honestly, just check out Old vs. New's Lost Factions. They effectively nailed the army list for the Halflings. We took a look at them yesterday if you're curious, and I'll leave a link down below, but there is a few things we need to change. Adding the Chuckwagon in as a Lord type, which picture a corpse cart but filled with food, the Halfling Housewives in Lord, Hero, and Infantry form, Great Eagle Riders, which are flying cavalry, Swan Riders, which are flying ranged cavalry, Goat Riders, which are cavalry with Strider, Lords of the Harvest, which are basically piggyback cavalry options, much like the Pig Riders from the Noblar Horde, Crazy Chefs, which are effectively Night Goblin Fanatics, the Reaper and Shearer, which is a brutal chariot unit that literally mulches up enemy infantry, and Sheepdogs, which are dogs, but they have a bonus to leadership for Battle Ram and Warsheep Riders. Those would all need to be added in, and then technically speaking, the Grand Enchanter from the mod only has a Halfling Wizard in the rules, but I can't imagine that anyone would mind another Lord option being present. Again, we're not going to get into every one of their units because that would be utterly redundant filler here, so let's move on to the next category. How would the Halflings play? Well, essentially death by 1,000 paper cuts. The Halflings do 2 things really well, ranged combat and cavalry. The former would represent where most of their actual damage output comes from, which is just oodles of decent ranged attacks raining down on your enemy, while they're distracted by infantry short enough to still fire over. The latter would be used primarily to keep your ranged units safe from enemy flying dog and spawn units, and used for the occasional removal of a fleeing squad, artillery platform, or a lone ranged unit. Where the Halflings would fall short would be in prolonged melee fights, such as against the Vampire Counts, or against tough as nails armored foes such as the Dwarves and Chaos Dwarves. Alright, that's battles down. What would their campaign experience be like? Again, I feel like Old vs. New actually gives us a pretty good lead for that. They would definitely possess the ingredients set up from Grand the Paunch, likely coupled with the food mechanic of the Skaven, but tweaked for the Halflings to give better stats and much better leadership. I could also see a mechanic where fighting in happy, friendly territories would give bonuses to troop, but fighting in unhappy, friendly territories, i.e. something below 0, or in enemy territories would give a malice to your troops. This would force the Halflings to be a much more empire builder style of a faction, where slow, thought-out expansion is far more beneficial than just rapidly expanding in all directions. So, what do I think the odds of the Halflings ever showing up are? Honestly, not half bad. They've got a bunch of named characters, an army list courtesy of White Dwarf, tons of lore, multiple practical starting locations, opportunities for more DLCs down the road, a unique aesthetic, and anything else we could ever ask for in a faction for Total Warhammer. I'm not going to run around exclaiming Halflings confirmed or anything along those lines, but I genuinely think the Halflings have better chances than a lot of Game 3 options. Certainly better than the Noblar Hordes in Koresh, and frankly I think they still offer even more than the Hobgoblin Khanate or Cathay do for CA to utilize. The former lacks most of an army list and has almost no lore, while the latter lacks almost anything except for lore. So there you have it, the second half of our silly races head to head. So, which one did you like more as a faction option? Or, frankly, did you like neither of them? Is there another potential faction you want to see investigated down the road? Let me know down below, and as always, I want to thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I hope to see you all next time.